And still looking at the conditions there in the United States, as jobless numbers continue to skyrocket, pressure is mounting on states to reopen their economies after the crippling impact of the COVID-19 outbreak. Amidst rising fatalities and infections countrywide, the state of Georgia became one of the first to break ranks and announce a partial reopening as of tomorrow.
Given the favorable data, enhanced testing, and approval of our healthcare professionals, we will allow gyms, fitness centers, bowling alleys, body art studios, barbers, cosmetologists, hair designers, nail care artists, estheticians, their respective schools, and massage therapists to reopen their doors this Friday, April the 24th. Subject to the specific social distancing and sanitation mandates, theaters, private social clubs, and restaurant dine-in services will be allowed to reopen on Monday, April the 27th.
Public health officials have been aghast at Georgia's decision, which ignores federal guidelines issued last week that outline benchmarks, including 2 weeks of declines in infections, hospitalizations, and deaths, a trajectory that Georgia has yet to achieve. And despite championing reopenings across the country, President Donald Trump was forced to weigh in.
I told the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, that I disagree strongly with his decision to open certain facilities which are in violation of the Phase 1 guidelines for the incredible people of Georgia. They're incredible people. I love those people. They're great. They've been strong, resolute, but at the same time, he must do what he thinks is right. I want him to do what he thinks is right. But I disagree with him on what he's doing, but I want to let the governors do. Now, if I see something totally egregious, totally out of line, I'll do. But I think spas and beauty salons and tattoo parlors and barber shops in Phase 1, we're going to have Phase 2 very soon, is just too soon. I think it's too soon.
Was also echoing in the mind of our own president, Cyril Ramaphosa, saying in a tweet earlier on that he had a very productive conversation with US President Donald Trump earlier on, as you can see in this tweet. So for more on this and others, looking at other regions as well, grappling with similar concerns of phased reopenings, we're joined by our US Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. So, Sherwin, let's first start with the conversation between President Cyril Ramaphosa and that of US President Donald Trump. He calls it productive. Do we have any indication as what could have been the content thereof?
Well, I imagine a lot of focus, Tsepiso, on the reopening of the South African economy in view of the fact that this is something that the United States now is also engaged in. I'm sure President Trump shared with President Ramaphosa his federal guidelines, the three-phased approach which Georgia, the state of Georgia, has missed in its announcement in terms of reopening starting tomorrow. So I imagine sharing best practices, what works in the United States, what could work in South Africa. And President Trump, in his daily briefings to PISA, has talked a lot about the oversupply now of ventilators in the United States. He says he's been getting calls from heads of state and heads of government around the world seeking ventilators. Of course, one of the critical equipment devices needed in saving people's lives around the world. So maybe there was a conversation about South Africa needing ventilators and what that would cost. But we'll have to get more details from the presidency here and certainly in Pretoria.
Speaking about Georgia, as you mentioned, showing that President Trump being forced to chastise the Georgia governor, is this an about turn, or is it just some of the ridiculous sectors that Georgia has felt that it needs to open up? I mean, I look at my nails daily, but is it really necessary?
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people are looking at their nails and their hair, and I think sales in hair clippers have gone through the roof. But yeah, I mean, essentially, what the president is trying to do here is walk a tightrope. He wants the economy to reopen as soon as possible. I mean, it's decimated jobs in this country. Some 26 million people have filed for unemployment since lockdown measures went into place, and this is something the president has spoken about from the earlier days when numbers were spiraling through the roof here in terms of hospitalizations, intubations, and deaths in the United States. So he's walked a very tightrope and has had discussions with governors about reopening. But what the governor of Georgia has done here is ignore the very guidelines that were put out by the Trump administration and his White House Corona Task Force that talks about a 2-week trajectory before you can implement what Georgia wants to go into is phase 1 tomorrow. You have to see 2 weeks of declines, hospitalizations, the need for ICU beds, the death rate. And in addition to that, you need the capacity to contact trace and test once economies are open. Health professionals are telling us that once you open, you should expect numbers to go up anyway. They're not going to stay where they are. They will go up when social distancing measures are eased. That's just the science. So what capacity do states, do countries have in terms of dealing with the rise that you're going to see once those restrictions are eased? And that's the big question here that Georgia's ignored.
And I want to talk about this, and I say this rather tongue-in-cheek, the opening up of tattoo parlors. So if you're talking about testing and tracing, I suppose I might just apply that. I say that in a very light manner, but it is an important tool, just not only in the United States, but everywhere else, and an important benchmark in considering whether or not an economic reopening is essential.
Well, if you look at some of the countries in Europe and what some of those countries are reopening, they're opening up clothing stores for children. They're opening up bookstores and stationers, venues that are not going to see a huge surge of customers, of volume in terms of foot traffic if they were to open. Tattoo parlors, I mean, essentially this is a human being touching another human being. Hair salons, this is physical touches involved there. So it begs the question as to what sort of social distancing measures a tattoo parlor can impose when physical contact is kind of the name of the game here. So, as much as we talk about different phases of reopening economies, social distancing is not going to go away. If you look at what's going on in Spain and the measured response we are seeing from one of the hardest hit economies in Europe, they are handing out 10 million masks for people to use on public transport. So as much as you are reopening, mitigation does not go away. Social distancing, masks, wearing gloves, covering your face when you are in confined spaces like pharmacies and supermarkets, those measures are not going to go away. So this is a very unique situation that countries are going to be diving into. Imagine that you will hear things like this from President Ramaphosa. Yes, we'll open certain stores, certain industries in a phased approach, but social distancing measures are going to be employed outside of companies and inside of companies, Tsipi. So if we all go back to work, for example, people that cannot telecommute, construction workers, people that work in forestry and fisheries, those people are going to have to apply some sort of social distancing despite the fact that they're back at work.
And obviously all of this aspirational for countries like ours feeling the impact of an economic downturn. Let's look at the world's second largest economy, China. It's been phasing in the opening up of the economy. What lessons can be learned there, or any trends that are emerging?
When South Africa went into lockdown, China was reopening its economy, right? They'd managed to arrest the infection rate. They've managed their death toll leveled out and started declining. But what we have not seen is the foot traffic returning. We see that some industrial complexes have about 90% of their workforce returning, but they've also opened up hair salons and gyms and movie theaters, and capacity there is only edging towards 50%. In addition, Tsepiso, think about the economic impact when you are reopening, the economic hit that countries have felt during this crisis. People have lost their jobs. Industries, some businesses will close and not reopen. And so the notion that you go, you sort of snap your fingers and turn on the switch, That's not going to happen. It's going to be a phased return from a consumer perspective. People are very cautious now psychologically returning to the streets. You might say, okay, everything's back open. You can go to your hair salon, but I assure you, you're not going to see a long line, a long queue outside that hair salon with people queuing up and lining up to get in, because psychologically we're so reluctant to put ourselves at risk now, just given the restrictions that we're implementing now. So China is not seeing the level of the return economic activity that it saw pre this crisis. It's struggling also with the sharp rise in employment. People just don't have the money to go out and spend. And I think that's going to be something similar experienced in the United States, given the 26 million people that have lost their jobs in the last 5 weeks and the numbers that you're seeing in South Africa.
Sherwin, thank you very much for that. SABC US Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. And as I mentioned, all of these things going through, President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to address the nation in about an hour's time from the times that we've been given. So let's just take a look at another tweet. And this went out earlier on. He also said that he had just concluded a meeting of the National Command Council where he said they were focused on a risk-adjusted strategy to resume economic activity. I am now meeting with leaders of political parties, he said, represented in Parliament for further consultations ahead of tonight's address. And that pretty much echoes what the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said earlier on, that the well-being of human beings, the well-being of the nation should be at the forefront of any intervention. So